Hello, my name is Willie Tunyiswa, and welcome to the Open Wound Research Podcast. I'm very excited today to welcome someone that I've known a long time, and I think is probably the most interesting person in the world of value-based reimbursement in wound care, and that is the great Julie Rhodovi. How are you doing today, Julie?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for accepting on short notice. I know we reached out to you in the middle of summer, and you were probably gallivanting about with the family and business. So I appreciate you making time.
Happy to do so.
All right, so I'm going to give a quick introduction of your background to the audience. And your background is quite extensive, I must say. I mean, there's not much you have not done in wound care on the non-clinical side. So you hold your MBA from University of Phoenix. You have served on the Alliance of Wound Care Stakeholders Board, the Post-Acute Wound and Skin Integrity Council, aka PAWSIC. You are also, I believe, a treasurer with the American Board of Wound Management Foundation. You
Yes.
also served on the MPIAP, the National Pressure Ulcer Advisory Panel, which, by the way, I did not know. And you are a provider council member on public policy committee member. And I believe you're also on the American Board of Wound Management.
I was a past board member of the ABWM, yes, and now sit on the foundation as a board of trustee.
Wow. When you sent this over, I was amazed because I know that you are out and about in wound care, but you truly are spanning quite a few different things out there. I guess, one of my first questions is with this vantage point that you have, what have been some of the most interesting things you've seen this year, particularly given your vista?
Well, this year has been a definite year of growth in wound care. And, PAWSIC, I'm a co founder of this particular nonprofit, really focusing in on the post acute space of wound care. And in that role, as well as my role on the Alliance and ABWM Foundation, what I'm really seeing constantly is this shift where we really are starting to open our minds to what is happening in the world of reimbursement with wound care. Wound care has always been this space that has been scrutinized and looked at very carefully when it comes to payment processes. But I'm seeing this change where we're really starting to take a step back and look at what's happening within this structure and are there changes that could be made. And being a part of these nonprofits and being a part of these boards really gives me a different perspective because you sit at a table with this amazing interdisciplinary focus where there are people of all walks of life in all different focuses within wound care that come with a different perspective. And it really opens you up to what could be the future and where do we need to go to make the right changes that are going to focus to the best care of the patient.
That's excellent, and I think we'll drill down on that a bit more as we continue the discussion today. But perhaps you had to get here from somewhere, and so between your MBA and your time at a large part B biller, which is ironically where we met, I believe in two was it 2011 or 2012? I think it was.
Probably right around 2011, I would think. Yes.
Yeah, we were. I was out on in New Jersey, as they call it, and I think we met at the New Jersey conference or the Pennsylvania conference, I believe.
Yes, you're right. It was one of those.
So, but prior to that, I mean, how? So you graduate with your MBA, you end up at this company. What happened in between? How did you find your way into wound care?
Yeah, so I started my career actually working in nursing homes. I started out as a social worker and really wanted to be a health administrator, wanted to go down the path of doing my AIT and becoming a nursing home administrator. And I was a couple years into this adventure of getting into the AIT program and walking through those processes and realized that I was really more focused and more interested in the reimbursement side of healthcare and really wanted to understand this process. Like a lot of people that work directly with patients, I was frustrated with the Medicare system and I was really interested in seeing the alternatives. And so I had an opportunity to work with United Healthcare in 2001, which I took. And that was right when Medicare Advantage plans were really kind of on the startup and kind of rolling through, and especially special needs plans. And that's where I really spent most of my focus and my time when I was with United Healthcare was uh, producing, writing, really building special needs plans and building the processes along with them. And in that, really started to understand the payer side of the world, really started to see this balance. And, wound care was one of those places that I was always a little fascinated with because it's this space that doesn't have a level of tooling. It's very siloed in its reimbursement structure when it comes to the payer side of the world. And then on the clinical side, on the provider side, there's that lack of specialty. And these two things allow it to be this space of healthcare that lacks clarity on standardization. So it was really a space that I always kind of spent more time focusing on and more time looking at. And when I was kind of done with my time with United Healthcare, I built out a special needs plan and rolled it out across the country. I had an opportunity to go and work with American Medical Technologies at the time. That's what they were called. And I spent a good amount of my career with them. I was with them for about 17 years. And when I first started with them, uh, it was just Medicare Part B billing, really no further expansion. And I really started to see this need to expand into a different level of payment and open up that portfolio a little bit and expand that. And I kind of went to the owners and said, "Can I explore this? Can I look at this?" And they said, "Sure, go for it." And so I started having conversations with payers and building relationships with them. And what I realized in this process is that on a private payer side, there was a tiny bit more flexibility. And I know that Medicare Advantage plans have a rough reputation with a lot of providers. It's a tough space to really understand and to really integrate yourself in. But I was fortunate to have the time to do that and really have those really hard conversations, bringing in my clinical colleagues to help really position the space of what was going to be best when it came to the quality of care of the patient. And in turn, what was then going to lead to less expenses to the payer. And when this all kind of started to flesh out over quite a few years, it got my mind kind of spinning into this alternative reimbursement model and this idea that there's something a better way to do this. Um, I as well at that time kind of dealt with a personal situation with my father where I truly saw this hardship due to a lack of multidisciplinary synchronization of our healthcare system and this tangled system of lack of coordination. Those combination of things made me start to really think about wound care in a little bit of a different setting and made me realize that we were still looking at this siloed reimbursement. There was no encouragement of interdisciplinary work and coordination of services that would, number one and most importantly, be better for the patient and lead to a better quality of care, but also very importantly, lead to a more structured payment system that would get rid of the extra and really make sure that the streamline of service was to the best of both worlds.
Sure. So when you perhaps let's drill down on the idea of a silo, right? I believe I know what you mean, but perhaps for the audience, could you perhaps drill down and describe what you mean by this siloing of in wound care?
Yeah. So, wound care and the way that claims are processed can fall into different buckets. And what payers look at is their costs in, for instance, outpatient facilities, their costs in DME, their costs in prescription drugs. And these are very separated out. And wound care, you've got claims kind of going to all these different buckets. So, I can give you a for instance of a conversation I had with a pretty large payer at one point that I was kind of pitching the idea of, is there something bigger out there? Can we start to look at this a little bit larger? And their response was, well, we don't have an issue when it comes to chronic wounds. So I said, can I give you the top 10 ICD-10 codes for you to dig into your data and come back to me and still tell me that you don't have an issue? And this was a commercial plan. It wasn't a Medicare Advantage plan. So it was a very different, typical age bracket. And they came back to me a few weeks later and were astounded because they had found a patient that had costed them over $500,000 that they were unaware of. And typically in a payer system, these things are flagged a little bit, and you can kind of start to see and provide case management, provide utilization management, and really try to see what's happening with that patient. But because of the way that the payment and the claims processing was being done in different sectors, nobody was tracking that this patient had gone to the emergency room several times, had had many outpatient visits in different outpatient settings, and therefore was getting different prescriptions and different DME needs. So there was no connection of service. And what that was bringing to, in their eyes, was a very high cost patient. But what was bringing more importantly to the patient was this lack of resolution, this lack of answers and coordination of service that were unfortunately leading this patient down a road that was going to lead to a quality of life that was going to be completely detrimented. So, it really was eye-opening to me because I knew the payer system well enough to know that, we kind of sit in these different spaces with claim processing, but to kind of have that conversation with a cost and care strategy person to say, is this really a concern, was eye-opening. And really that is something that I'm seeing in the past, probably about 24 months. I'm starting to see that shift. I'm starting to see payers spend a little bit more time in this space. Chronic wound care is a top 5 spend of Medicare. It's a big deal. There's a lot of money that goes into this. However, there is this lack of focus, and my gut tells me it's because of we're looking at a reimbursement structure that is not funneling everything into one bucket. It's in these different silos, and it allows for that separation where the claims that are being looked at and being processed, we're not really looking at that cost of care as a whole.
And so that there's a couple of questions I have about that. So once you identify these cohorts of patients that perhaps the payers don't realize they even have because they are disparate ICD-10 codes, and in their minds they never clustered those codes together.
Mhm.
They get this reaction, right? And probably the reaction is like, "Holy mother," 500,000 to a million on a patient is extreme. In your experience, are payers then taking that information to say, "Okay, we want to cut the cost, the waste, but we do realize that there's a cohort of wound care patients that we can save long-term money by having better short-term and maybe more expensive care"? Is that a discussion point?
So it will be, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. And I say we will be because I do see the silver lining. I think that we're going to get there. We're not quite ready. I don't believe I've seen payers quite ready to get to that point of recognition. That cost curve means that there may be some further spend at the beginning. There may be a further need of coordination of service. There may need to be more dietitian involvement, diabetic educators, other aspects of care that's multidisciplinary that are going to, in the initial look, up that cost. However, it's going to flatten it out further and it's going to lower it at the end. That is a point of conversation. And that's really where alternative payment models, value-based care, could truly fit very well in this space as we move forward. Payer systems are still trying to catch up with this world. And, one of the challenges of value-based care, and when we walk into that spot and start to talk about that alternative reimbursement model space, a big challenge there is an investment in the technology. and the data analytics that have to happen in order to really start to look at this. And that includes things like AI. And in wound care, because it isn't a specialty, because there isn't that standard pathway, getting those types of technologies into the bucket and starting to look at data and how it is really look at the process of this, that is the next step. And getting into that space and really investing in that as a VBC will start to show the payers this is the pathway. This is what's going to happen. And this is what we need to make happen in order to save that dollar at the end. So I think I'm very hopeful that we will get there. And I think that we're close because payers are starting to sit up and recognize. I've had some conversations with some actuaries on the payer side recently where they are starting to recognize that this is a concern and a solution is necessary. So bringing a solution to them and showing them that is kind of that next step.
That's brilliant. I have a special interest in this, and I think I badgered you two socks ago when we did the poster on the lifetime of
Yes,
patient value. I apologize to this day. I badgered you for like an hour about it.
I
But,
love it.
this is at OWR. I came from post acute from a mobile practice, and with my marketing background, I started thinking about these costs. I was like, oh my goodness, okay, so we see these patients. Most of them we see for less than a month, right? Then they disappear, they transition. You don't observe them. Doesn't necessarily mean the wound is gone, but you just don't observe them. And then we have these patients that form this tail. And in the extreme of that tail, you could be seeing this patient for 3, 4, 5. I think the longest lived patient in the practice I was in was 12 years.
Wow.
So take the cost of a full pressure, full thickness pressure ulcer, and times it by 3 years of intense care. Right? And then we started looking at that case. We saw that they were going to the hospital, and I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, if you could get a real financial picture of what this one patient cost, it would
Mm-hmm.
be extraordinary. And
Yes.
so I've had this interest. We've talked together, and with your post acute background, um, one question I would ask to you is: you've got your ambulatory patients, you got your inpatient. I mean, these populations. Do you think the post acute population is the most expensive population relative to all these other parts of the healthcare system?
I do. And the reason I do, and this I love this question, is because when you're looking at that post acute space, which defining it as long term care, home health, hospice, outpatient in that space, what I would call non acute adjacent. Right? Acute adjacent meaning attached to an acute facility or going in that space. The post acute is the length of time. It's that chronic wound space. When a patient exits an acute facility and goes into a subacute space of care, if they have a wound, it kind of starts there and moves forward. That expense is, my gut tells me, is one of the largest. And it really kind of in that space, looking at that, when you're talking about a patient in an acute setting, there there already is a synchronization of service because that patient is under one health system, under one roof, and those providers are all connected, whether it be through an EMR system or through that health system, they're connecting in that space. When a patient leaves and goes into post acute, you have several different pieces coming into the picture. That lack of coordination does result in many situations, a higher pay structure and higher amounts of dollars. And the amount of care that's needed and the type of care that's needed in order to get that patient on the right road of healing can definitely add up in that space. No doubt about it.
So let's take a step back. I apologize. I had my agenda, but I couldn't help myself and jump right into the value.
That's okay.
I find it so interesting that my brain wants to go and grab as much time talking about it with you because I just think your expertise in that is extraordinary. Maybe let's take a step back. You are currently working, I believe, with PAWSIC, which is the Post-Acute Skin Integrity Council. Maybe if we can spend a little bit of time talking about the work that's being done there. I'm an old post-acute guy, so I love hearing about that. And then after that, if we could talk about your work with the Alliance. And then I really want to come back to this value-based managed care. And I think, your role's shifting soon in and around that. But if we can talk about PAWSIC and the Alliance and come back to the value-based, I just want to make sure that people benefit from hearing about some of the other work that you're doing.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So POSIC is an exciting adventure. I am one of the founding members of this nonprofit. I started this adventure, started having conversations about this adventure quite a few years ago and went through the process to get our 501c and become a nonprofit. And, when we started down this road and as we've evolved, what it truly came down to is the folks that I have had the great privilege of doing this with. We all truly saw a gap and a need in the post acute setting for wound and skin education, really a focus in this space. And that focus being not just for providers, but for patients and for families as well. So we're new to the game. We just officially announced ourselves in fall of SAWC fall. So it's been less than a year that we've been around, but we are growing. We have a robust membership and sponsorship happening, which is fantastic. And what we're really focusing on right now is interdisciplinary education, really making sure that we're focusing in the post acute arena to make sure that it's everybody that's involved. It's the physician, it's the nursing staff, dietitian, diabetic educator, physical therapist, social workers, the patient, the family, everybody that's involved in that patient's care. And that's the education that we are really focusing on at this point. We are in the process of walking through our first strategy planning sessions and really trying to focus ourselves to make sure that we are fulfilling our mission and our vision as a nonprofit. But more importantly, we all have this fantastic passion to see post acute wound and skin education come to a different space and build out advocacy from that. And that advocacy we talk about isn't just policy advocacy, but it's community based, it's education, it's strengthening the process. Post acute wound care is this different spot. And when we talk about post acute, again, it's long term care, it's home health, it's hospice, it's patients that are in the community, as well as patients that live in assisted living and nursing homes. And wound care is not always the prettiest thing. And there are patients out there that have issues and have problems, and they don't know who to go to. They don't know if they should call their physician or their pharmacist. They're not sure where to go for the care that they need. And so we are hoping to be that resource and be that space, as well as for the practitioners and for the providers that service this population, giving them tools, giving them guidance, allowing them to voice their opinions and have some education associated with it. So we're really excited to where this is going to go, and who knows where it will head, but we are along for the ride at this point, and really working hard to see this through and to be that support system for the post-acute environment.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's absolutely
Yeah.
brilliant. And I know your partner in crime over there, Janine McGuire, who, by the way, I tell Janine the story all the time. So we had about 400 nursing homes that we were servicing, and we had a couple of her old companies' buildings that we were servicing, and I came across like a 200-page ode to wound care that she had written for the company. And so I said to the administrator, I'm not going to say her name or where it was. I said, "Hey, can I take a look at that?" And so she said, "Oh yeah, you can have it." And so I read Janine's ode, literally an ode on wound care. And, I always make fun of her when I see her now that I said, I stole your work. It was amazing, the work that she had done. And so knowing her and knowing you and knowing some of the other members that are part of PAWSIC, I'm proud of the work that you're doing because I have a piece in my heart for these patients that were the people who built our country, who fought wars, who raised us, well, not me, I was in Africa, but who raised my wife's generation. And I have a soft spot for making sure that they get what they need, particularly with wound care. And so I
Yeah.
think the work that you guys are doing is amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic. Janine is wonderful. Sarah Holden Mount, Mary Lee Grosso, who comes with a pharmaceutical background, which is an amazing, and then Dr. Diane Krasner. So we have we're the founding executive team, and we're just pushing forward and continuing to grow. And it's been a really amazing adventure. And I look forward to kind of continuing down this path. But it's been great. It's been really fun. It does not surprise me though that you, knowing you, Swelly, that you said, "Hey, can I have that?" Because that's so you. And I'm sure I've seen Janine's work, and it's amazing. And I can only imagine what that booklet has in it. It's probably filled with amazing knowledge and information.
Oh, it was extraordinary. It was 2013. And at the time, to your point about sort of this fraction, there wasn't a clear, in many nursing homes, there isn't a clear vision
Yeah.
of what wound care is. And in many corporate groups, there isn't a clear vision of what wound care is. It tends to be reactive, right? Oh
Mhm.
my God, we got a stage 4 pressure ulcer, we got a tag, or something bad happened, and now we have to do something. And then when we do that thing, and we get a piece of paper that says we're okay, we're going to go back to doing what we did before.
Yes.
And reading Janine's ode, I'll continue to call it an ode, there was a clear vision of what good wound care was and
Hmm.
what the expectations were for it and the accountability pathways when it failed. And
Hmm.
so it was really instrumental early on in my development to we had that vision for our practice, but we were not a nursing home group. So seeing a nursing home group articulate that, I was like, that was at least 8 years before its time. And so it was quite extraordinary.
And what you just said is so true about wound care. It is reactive, and that that's an issue with our reimbursement structure with it. It is very reactive in its space. And I feel like in the post acute arena, that's even a bigger problem. So it's certainly a great term.
So stretching our legs for a second and kind of encompassing the greater healthcare system, you work with the Alliance and Marcia and her team over there, Crystal, I believe, Quinn, great people. What are you guys working on and what kind of battles are you fighting nowadays?
Yeah. I'm so privileged to be on their board. I've sat on the Alliance as a member for many years when I was with my past organization, and it was thrilling to watch this group of people come together and really push forward on different aspects of need when it came to policy change. And so when I was offered a nominated to be on their board and got to go through that interview process, it was such a privilege. And I'm just thrilled to be on their board at this point. And a lot of focus. We just the OPPS just came out. I think it was 2 days ago. So every time a new proposed rule walks out the door, Marcia and her team are on it in a matter of minutes and just taking a look and climbing through it to provide to the board and all the members. Here's what we have to focus on, and here's what we have to kind of push back on and write forward. So certainly, we're all fully aware of the cellular tissue product proposed rule that recently walked into our world, and that was, comment letters and processes, but really also right now focusing a lot on surgical dressings, and are there different changes within those policies that need to really be focused on. But it's a constant. That's one thing I've learned in my time with this group, is that It's not just, the quick, listserv email that pops up that says, hey, there's this thing coming. There's all these other little things. And, one of the things I've learned in wound care on the regulatory side is that things can happen behind the scenes that aren't really kind of in that public eye, but you do need to constantly keep an eye on that. And, policy articles, for instance, they can be edited without comment period. And so if you're not kind of keeping an eye on those things and knowing it, there can be small changes here and there that can affect certain aspects of your practice or your process as you're going through. So, being a part of the alliance really allows me to have that visual and have a voice at the table, which I personally think is really important. And I feel like anybody that's in the wound care space, whatever your position might look like, it's important to be able to voice your opinion. And it's not always on those policy changes and those comments that immediately when you see it, it's going to directly affect you. There are ones that are a little bit more, you got to kind of get through the smoke and the mirrors to find that maybe there's a new sentence in there that might kind of affect the way that you do something and could, at the end of the day, affect your P&L as a business. So, it's definitely a process, and it's a constant. I will say that just when you when you think it's kind of calmed down, here come the emails. And I do have to say, I've sat on many boards in my career. The Alliance has such an active board, and Marcia and her staff are really fantastic at getting on things very quickly and pushing them out to the members so that everybody has the visual that they need to really make sure that they're fully aware of what's happening within the industry.
No, and that they are. I'm always impressed by their emails, and I think I
Yes.
misspoke earlier. I said Crystal, I mean Kristen. They do great work, and it's always interesting sitting in. OWR is a member currently, and sitting in and just getting a lot of learning. And at the last session was extraordinary having a medical director, really
Yes.
talking to us. So that
Mhm.
was that was that was a great experience.
That was a treat. I mean, Dr. Graves she was real, she was personable, and she answered questions directly, which, we've, let's face it, not every medical director that we've had a conversation with does that. But she did, and it was really great. So it was fantastic that Marcia and her team were able to get her to come and be a speaker.
Well, we got about 26 minutes or so, and I'm going to be a little bit selfish and let's go back to reimbursement. I could talk for hours, and I want to make sure that the audience gets a lot of value out of this, but being a little bit selfish, I want to get a lot of value out of it as well. We've talked a little bit before about managed care in general, about the idea of how payers are starting to look at things and what change is occurring.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the changes that are occurring from your perspective and your context right now, and maybe have a conversation around that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for about the past 2 years, I have been a private consultant and have been focusing my time working with different provider groups on revenue cycle, payer contracting, different things. And about 9 months ago, I got an opportunity to join a fantastic group of people. Janine McGuire is part of that people as well, to build a program called Tissue Health Plus. And I am taking a role as their chief commercial officer. And this is a value based care program that is specialty for wound care. So it's to this level that we are pushing, it hasn't quite been done yet. So it's really taking the chronic wound spend that we've been talking about, that top 5 spend, and shifting the focus from volume to outcome and synchronizing the processes among practitioners. So, value based care is really a transformative approach that, again, shifts that focus from that volume of service to providing to the value and the outcome of care delivered to the patient. It's very different, and it's aligning those incentives. So you've got the payer, the provider, and the patient, and everybody has their own agenda. And what value based care does when it's done right is it truly aligns the incentives and makes sure that the goal and the outcome is better health at a lower cost. That is truly the goal. And what's required, especially in wound care, in order for that to happen, is prevention, coordination, education. Education's a big one. And I say that because, and I mentioned earlier dealing with my own father in situations of healthcare. So as a type 2 diabetic, when you go to the physician's office and they say eat right and you leave, do you know what eat right means? Do you know how to translate that into what your diet should really look like? So when I talk about education, that becomes a really big piece of this. So what we're doing in Tissue Health Plus is we're thinking about all of those things. We're thinking about that prevention, that care coordination, that education, especially to the patient, but also to the providers, to synchronize those processes and pull in an interdisciplinary approach so that we can take all of those different pieces and build a level of tooling that then builds the right price and the right expectation on the payer side. This isn't easy. And as I said earlier, there are always challenges with value based care. When you're building a value based care program that is a specialty based program, that specifically in wound care, you're going to find those challenges. Data analysis becomes a very big and an important piece to that, and truly investing in that space, but really taking on into consideration an AI process with wound care. Working with providers to watch the process of the care pathway and determine that need of care pathway, and then looking at the end result, looking at that healing and saying, which one's best? Which care pathway? But also not just looking at one pathway for that patient, because we know that a diabetic foot ulcer for a patient, for instance, it could be all a Wagner grade 2 in 4 different patients, but you could need 4 different paths of care. Because then on top of building that pathway, you also have to look at the risk adjustment factors for that patient. What other items are that patient dealing with? Are there medications that could potentially be slowing healing? Is there arterial insufficiency? Is there obesity? Are we dealing with uncontrolled glucose? What are we working with that we need to then take into perspective? So building that value-based care program really takes into consideration all of those different pieces to truly figure out, is there a way to do this? There's a lot of risk in this always, right? Anytime an alternative reimbursement model is created or developed, there is risk. But taking into perspective 3 different aspects: the science, the clinical pathway, and the reimbursement with those risk adjustment factors, taking all those different pieces and building out something has an opportunity to actually grow and to move. But to your point earlier, Zweli, you've got to also convince that payer of that cost curve difference and really look at, yes, this patient's baseline cost with this type of wound, with this type of situation, would typically have costed $120,000. So let's take it down to this dollar instead. That might mean that you have to spend a little bit more that first month or 2, because you do have to get that dietitian involved quickly. You do have to have a base of care coordination. You do have to make sure you've got that vascular consult done. There's all these things you've got to get done at the beginning. You need lab work. You need all these things so that you can see a full picture of what you're dealing with to really make sure you're putting that patient in the right pathway. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do this a little bit differently.
Question. I have a bucketload of questions. So you make an interesting point about sort of the garden of forking paths on treatment, right? So, we've seen this. We've seen this enough. You do the same thing to 5 patients that present exactly the same way, and then you get 3 different outcomes. And you go, okay, they're the same patient, they presented the same way, superficially they're similar. So there's this garden of forking paths that you kind of have to deal with, right? Because when you're assessing your clinical pathways and A/B testing them. I'm a kind of a data science guy, so I think to myself, okay, you have A intervention, B and intervention C. So you have to say, okay, I believe intervention A works the best. But then you have to define what the best is and what are the covariates of the cohort that would benefit the best from pathway A. How you guys kind of deal, because that's a very complicated, interesting idea that you kind of have to grapple with.
Yeah. So it's a little bit of everything. It's bringing in the science of this, really looking at the science of the wound itself, but it's also, again, taking into perspective what risk adjustments need to be brought into this picture. And when we talk about risk adjustment factors in the Medicare Advantage side of our world and in managed care, we think about that HCC, that hierarchical coding that it's out there. But even those are very high level. They're not very granular. So wound care, you've got to get down deep. You've got to really kind of look at not just diabetes as a complication. You've got to look at glucose levels. So you kind of have to take it one step down. And that's a big piece of the process, is to really make sure that we're uncovering every stone, and we're really looking at all the different potentials. And this is also, we're doing all this work, but then there's going to be a time that we're also going to sit back and look at the data, look at the backup and look at the claims and watch it unfold, and then take a step back, and maybe there are changes. And that's really where that AI function comes in and the technology associated.
Sure. I mean, the thing that always fascinates me about wound care, that excited me about sort of the data science of wound care, which was one of the reasons that, uh, Ryan and I started Open Wound Research, was sort of these multivariate problems, right? So you
Yeah.
have a diabetic foot ulcer, venous leg ulcer, and a pressure ulcer. They're all wounds, right? But
Yeah.
if you attempt to treat them as homogeneous, you're going to get yourself in a bucketload of trouble. And even
Mhm.
within each of those wound types, there are substantive differences between a Wagner 1 and another type of Wagner, or a stage 1 or 2 pressure ulcer versus a stage 3 or 4 pressure ulcer. And in the world of pressure ulcers, it gets even more complicated, as you know. I mean, you said on the NPIP, but you have this time varying component where something that presented initially as a 1 may become a 2, may become a 3, may become a 4, and it's not a set target.
Mhm.
So it's your again, the key from a data science perspective, and I think this is what you're kind of attempting to discover, is what are the core essential covariates that
Mhm.
link performance to better outcome, to better savings for insurance companies, right? Like,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's challenge number one. you know, like, there's also this culture change, this shift that needs to happen in our industry and in our healthcare system. Fee for service, and pay, that quantity over quality. That's kind of the way that we functioned. It's the way our systems function, right? So when you think about technology and the systems that are out there, what a provider office uses to bill their claims, what a payer uses, even the payer systems aren't ready for this, right? Everything is based on your ICD-10 code, and then the HCPCS and the CPTs associated, and that's the way the systems are built. There's this culture shift, and it's it's emotional. And I know that sounds odd to say that, but it is, because even you know, our world has been, if I build this HCPCS, if I build this CPT, this is the dollar I'm going to expect. Value based care isn't like that. It can be similar to that, in depending on the contract that you have with the VBC that's holding that process and really becoming the payer in that space. But at the end of the day, that structure is a little different, because then there's quality performance bonuses and different aspects of payment. That is emotional. It becomes a space of constant conversation. And I don't know that, well, I will say, I think that some providers are ready for it. Some folks out there are saying, yep, I'm ready to take this challenge on. Others aren't so much. There's that uncertainty and that scare. And that's a big piece. And then on top of that, you've got to think about how are you going to get that process done on a claim processing system that's going to work for all the different systems that are involved. So you've got your payer claim system, you've got providers that are trying to figure out how they're going to get paid and how it's going to flow into their process so that their profit and loss statements and their processes kind of can stay even. And then you've got your whole EHR side, right? So you've got electronic health records that you've got to figure out how to interface with to make sure that they're kind of staying in the loop as well. So there are this culture challenge that I call it a culture challenge because I feel like we're so used to doing it this way, and we're going to flip it. And value-based care and alternative reimbursement models are not going anywhere. These are growing. They started Medicare Advantage plans was the first of its kind, right? The federal government, Medicare and Medicaid, pay lump sums to that private payer, and that private payer's got to figure out how to manage it. It's basically a value-based care program, right? And they've got to figure out how to be that flexible. Interestingly enough, they're the ones that are kind of opening their minds to VBC programs that are specialized because they do have the ability to kind of take a step back and say, okay, this patient is costing me $500,000. Why? And what can I do to control that and figure out, number one, what's best for the patient and what's going to provide the best quality of service. But then number two, be at a lower cost and a more controlled space. So this shift is happening, and there's a lot of conversation about VBCs and alternative reimbursement models and shifting in this direction to control that space a little bit. But as much as it's happening, we still need to emotionally and physically prepare for it and be ready for this as providers and operators that are in this space.
A question, my perspective on value-based reimbursement, I'm kind of a Jekyll and Hyde. On the one hand, even when I was part of the group, I wanted to go that direction because we had made the investments in clinical staff, had made the investments in building out clinical practice guidelines. So I was like, all right, we can vectorize this if we have the right partner. But it just never came to fruition because insurers were not ready. And I think the
Yeah.
market was not mature enough, right, at
Mhm.
that point. On the other hand, there is a lot of criticism of the fee for service structure and methodology. But I've
Yeah.
lived in South Africa with its socialized healthcare system. I've lived in Britain with its socialized healthcare system, Germany, in Japan as well. And so one of the sort of things that I learned and perhaps would be a valid criticism in a world of value-based reimbursement would be how do we ensure that we attract talent and
Yes.
investment into wound care, not only on the product side, but on the provider side, if the movement is too extreme in capping reimbursement at a level that's not make it economically feasible. Have you guys kind of thought about that?
Definitely. And that's a great point because at the end of the day, if you have a network of folks that are there to treat the patient, but they are not doing it with what I'm going to call the heart and the passion that's necessary for wound care, you're not going to help the system. It's not going to lead to a path of healing that is going to be better for the patient at the end of the day. So it does become important to make sure you have those right people. And, one of the things that we are really looking at and really focusing on is education. And I mentioned education earlier on a patient perspective, but this also comes on a provider perspective as well. And making sure that we have the right people in place on clinical advisory boards and different spots to really poke holes in a lot of the processes that are being developed, but also really make sure that as we create this and build out this, that the folks that come on board are have that same passion and that same drive and want to see this get better. And I think in any specialty of healthcare, you have bad actors. You know, an unfortunate article was just released in regards to fraudulent behavior and there was a big chunk of it that was in the wound care space. And I'm sure everyone has read the article. And, that bad actor space, it again is in every space of healthcare. This isn't just wound care. You see this everywhere. And you can read the OIG reports. I'm on their listserv. I get it. I get the email every day, and it's everything: dentistry, pharmaceutical, you name it. You've got to weed that out, and you have an opportunity to do that in value-based care because you are pulling in that network. And even in a process where you're building an open network that's consistently growing, there's an educational component. There's a contracting component where you can make sure that the culture and the values that you're creating for that VBC is something that's emulated throughout your network and your staff.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's the power of networks, good networks, is that they identify bad malfeasant behavior quicker at a
Yeah.
micro level, right? And I think what's happened, we have a data set internal to OWR where we were looking at the spend on some of these new products. And I know many of the parties that produce these products, and the majority of people are trying to solve the problem. They absolutely are. And they are committed to getting the research done, committed to finding the right patients who would benefit from their product. But there is a subset of people who, here, I'll give an example. I won't mention names, but I was in charge of the marketing for the group, and so we, saw tens of thousands of patients a year, and I would be getting these calls and about getting certain types of product, a specific one which I won't say, from chiropractor, and I was like, what's a chiropractor know about wound care? I don't understand what's going on. And that's when, in my mind, I was like, all right, something's not right here.
Yeah.
Because, when, not that, listen, chiropractors are great, but it is a little odd in wound care. And it, it definitely, we need better policing in our industry
Yeah.
to protect the good actors, kick out the bad actors, because the bad actors are what besmirch it for everybody else.
100%. And you and I had a conversation, I think, at SAWC around, the lack of specialty in wound care and how that does create the chiropractor from to walk in the door. But I think you're spot on in the fact that the majority of folks that are in this space have this passion and this want to make it better. And it's just making sure that those are the people, those are the ones that you want in your space, in your network, standing by your side to say, what do we do best? How do we make this work? How do we make sure there's a quality of life for this patient, a quality of care, that we are truly going to heal this patient? And, unfortunately, not every wound is healable. There are circumstances that lead situations to palliative need. And we need that perspective too. There's all different pieces to this. And, one thing I learned fast when I started consulting, I got lots of phone calls initially from provider groups saying, hey, we hear that you know about reimbursement in wound care. Can you teach us? Many of these groups were not wound care groups. They were different specialties that were deciding to get into this space. And I made a very fast call in the first month I was a consultant that it just gave me what my 21-year-old calls the ick. Just this sense of, yeah, I'm not gonna, I don't know that I want to swim in that arena. And I think that that's what it really comes down to, is really making sure that you're choosing the right network, that you're engaging with this network, that they have visual. Part of this is that technology of making sure that when you are pulling together a VBC, when you're working through building something, that you have the right technology to provide to those providers, that you make sure that they have those tools that they need and they have that visual. And in turn, so does your staff. So you can go through this process and pick the right folks and contract and get this up and running. But we all know that someone's going to kind of get in there that maybe at the end of the day isn't really focused the way you'd like for them to be. And those are conversations that have to happen. And there are, again, VBC has that quality based payment process attached to it, and all of them are structured a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, that's what this is about, is making sure that those aligned incentives that I mentioned earlier are in place. So that includes that network, it includes that patient, and it includes the payer. And the patient is a really big piece of this. The patient has to sign on. When value-based care programs for patients are, there's many different methodologies to how you kind of build out, and doing it on a volunteer level truly allows an opportunity for success, because that patient then becomes engaged in their own care, and getting that patient engaged in a space that maybe they didn't have in the past. Really making sure that they understand that this wound on their foot, on their leg, on their trunk area, wherever it might be, there is a process to healing it. And that process is going to take an interdisciplinary focus, and that includes them. And it includes their circle of care. Who else is involved? Do they live with family? Do they have family down the road? Do they live in a nursing facility and we involve their staff as their circle of care? Who else is there? But a really important piece to not just the bad actors of providers, but the bad actors of patients. That patient needs to sign on and needs to be a part of their care and take on that responsibility.
We would go to the nursing homes and we would spend all these resources trying to get people well. And
Yeah,
you have a patient at a DFU who we talk to, please, check your diet. Please, this is very important in terms of your care. And you'd see them eating a donut, And you'd go from an economic perspective. You have all these people working towards helping you with this wound. You got someone earning 140,000 driving an hour to come see you. You've
yeah,
got the people at the building, and God knows how much money is being spent to get them into that building to help you. You got all these products, drugs, etc., and all that investment to help you, but
right.
you're not doing your part.
Yeah.
you know.
But my question to that patient, and especially after kind of really digging into a lot of this VBC stuff, is, does the patient know that eating that donut means? Do they know that? Has anyone ever sat down and educated them and said, this is what you're doing, this is what you're putting into your body? And maybe taking a blood sugar if they don't have a CGM, and saying, and guess what happens, So there's an educational component there too. But you're absolutely right. Like, they've got to be a part of this.
No, absolutely. No, I'm excited about the CGM technology. I have like two of
Yeah,
them back there. I think it's a super exciting technology, and I think
it really is.
there's additional advancements in watch-based CGM coming
Mhm.
if Apple and Massimo can ever get done with their fight. Listen, the clock went off our time. I have. Well, one thing, we've got to have you back on. I'd love to hear more about the value-based reimbursement, because I think the world is shifting, and I think the more
Mhm.
people begin to understand what that looks like, what it could look like, the level of accountability that Medicare, I mean, even Medicare is saying they want 80%, I believe, and you can correct me, of their.
Years ago, they said by 2030 we want 100%. Now they're saying 80%. I think is their current. So I think they're hitting a little reality.
Yep, yep, yep. No, it's the sands are shifting, and you can bury your head in the sand, but it's coming. The more opportunity people have to hear about it, and with my background on the provider side, I think it's important for them to hear from people like you, who've been out there, that have worked out there, and who are really, in my mind, committed to getting the best care to the
Mhm.
patient, but also ensuring that the pipeline of care is looked after as well. Because what we don't want to do is to push great people out because it doesn't make sense.
Right.
Last question for you. So, if you had infinite resources and time, and you had to choose one thing, a wish you could make to the wound genie, the great nosocomial genie, what would that thing be if you had infinite resources and infinite time?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot, and I think I could name a lot of like magical tools out there, but I think that what I would just snap my fingers and do is to make wound care a specialty. I think that that would help our bad actor problem. I think it would create a space where there was opportunity for standardization, for pathways of service. It would provide something that it, it would provide a baseline. And that's kind of this missing link. So I think that that's what I would ask for.
Well, that's an absolutely pragmatic wish. It's probably the most pragmatic. So I appreciate that too. And I think, I worked in pain for a while, and pain had similar issues because,
Mm,
before I think 2005, anyone could stick a needle in the back.
yeah,
And so they had to grapple with
scary.
that, and how to get people certified so that it was safe for the patient and the payers could understand that it was being done properly. So
Yeah,
hopefully that comes to fruition. And given the many worlds that you live in, I think that you have a perch for that advocacy. So
yeah.
right there with you. All right. Well, listen, I've grabbed 5 more minutes than I should have. So I apologize for being a time thief, but I really find the work that you're doing very interesting, your insights. And I looked at your resume. I did not know you were a social worker before. I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah, that was my first career. I didn't know where I was going with it, but and it pulled me into the nursing homes, which I fell in love with within hours. Just the generation, the history of these people, their stories, I just loved dearly and knew immediately I wanted to go and stay in that post-acute space, no matter what it was that I was doing.
That's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and we definitely have to have you back on. And let's maybe plan in about 2 months. I think that a lot of the developments that are happening are going to be drawing people's attention to this more and more. And so I'd love to have you back so that we can drill down a little bit more.
Happy to be so. Thank you so much for the invite. This was amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the great Julie Rhodovi. And thank her for spending 1 hour and 5 minutes with us. And thank you for being on the Open Wound Research podcast.